Hello everyone, today we talk about the Umayyads of Cordoba and of their religious policy as well as the entire impact that this had in the Iberian Peninsula and also in North Africa, partly because we never talked in detail. I think I made only one video actually about the Fatimids so far, but as you know, the reinvigoration of the Shia power in North Africa, Egypt, and also what this meant for example, the control of the holy places of Islam in Western Arabia, in the Near East, had primarily for the Abbasids, that, as you know, were the ones that suffered the most from it, but also for the political reflections in fact, in the Emirate of Spain, as we will see that the Umayyads, albeit essentially having installed themselves as a ruling dynasty in Hispania, and having been the previous caliphs of the Dar Islam, overthrown in Damascus by the Abbasids, had not dared, interestingly enough, up to in fact, the early 10th century, and that's where the timeline also overlaps, or at least just follows in this sense, also consequentially, the Fatimid rise, to call themselves caliphs, as instead they would, since Abd-al-Rahman the third, that we will see, was also quite energically asserting that title in the first place, because it had properly not been even tried. Right, the Umayyads so far in Spain had been content just with the emiral one, that, as you know, is some sort of in fact, baronial title, even though it was actually something bigger. Right, this was a true principality and actually the only true state in Europe, besides Constantinople, and more of that later, because there is an important continuity, of course, with the previous Byzantine-inspired Visigothic tradition. In a sense, at least Islam was quite, radical in its own, affirmation and properly assessment of their universal role also in Spain. So we can talk about, a continuity between an ecclesiastical tradition and an Islamic, in fact, coincidence of the political rule, also with directly, properly, the military establishment that had control, that weren't, you see, the administrative side of the story, as we will see, the Umayyads stuck to the Maliki school of law, of the Sharia, and that was fundamental for their ideology, also in function of the Fatimids. But as I explained some months ago, when I actually stressed the success of the Umayyad Caliphate, and so that, as you know, brought Islam to the as a single empire to the largest extent, from, in fact, the Atlantic to the Indus to Central Asia, was this unity of intents, let's say, between the in fact, the spiritual force and the military one of that civilization. Whereas in Latin Germanic Europe, as you know, the thing was split. There was a church and there was an empire, and that would, say, for other reasons, not just for it actually, this may be not primary easily. But to a much more gradual, but somewhat, as you know, in the longer run, more successful, more solid civilizational development, also considering what properly the Western Empire had by this time had already come to be, right? Exactly because of this enormous, in fact, overlapping of the spiritual and the military in the same establishment. Right, and not as a separated church and state as it had always existed. Right, very often, like on the wake of the exaltation of the Enlightenment and anti-clerical ideas, that there is a good Enlightenment, right, and that was the latter aspect was definitely not the that one. We think that church and state were separated at some point, like after Westphalia. Church and state in Christendom have always been separated. This is written in the Gospels. It's not really something can be opinionated, and the fact that, of course, the state was Christian in the sense that this is still valid actually for many Western countries. The majority of the people and the institution, of course, recognize the Christianness of them. Doesn't mean that the state is the church. That literally never happened in Christian history, right? So it's incredibly important to stress, because it's, in my opinion, one of the greatest recipes properly of Western success, and even more for what happened in the West with essentially a competitive / cooperative behavior of the empire and the church, differently from Constantinople, where, as you know, the two things didn't overlap, but essentially the church was under the state, and this did bring to, in my opinion, a radical difference in the West between, in fact, the Catholic and the Orthodox world, as the first was much more aware, would remain much more aware of the overwhelming importance of the liberty of conscience. That is to say, you can be the emperor in absolute terms, but politically speaking, this doesn't mean absolutely that I have to obey you for a wrong reason, in spite of the fact that the Christian tradition, as you know, compared to the Islamic one, is also much more positively biased towards the earthly rule. That could open, in fact, an interesting parenthesis about the same Umayyad Spain, because lots of people, the Mozarabs, were fundamentally Christians, or Jews for that matter, were also lots of them, and that was also part of the reason why, in fact, the Visigothic kingdom had collapsed so quickly. Right, and it's a bit the same reason why the Islamic conquest has been so successful, because whether we like it or not, in a postmodern sense, the spread of Islam, in a sense, was the failure of the previous establishment, because any establishment is there only if the people decides there to be. So we have talked often about what happened in Syria and Palestine, in Egypt, under Byzantine rule, and how and why the Arabs were so successful, aside from the broader political military contingencies that, of course, surely affected the issue. Even a single Byzantine victory in the first phases in the 30s and the 40s of the 7th century may have crippled Islam for good, right? And many of those who had joined, they were pagans, by the way, would have essentially stopped supporting the one God religion, and simply driving away from Muhammad's leadership and one of his successors, but properly of that view of the world that in many ways was in fact was a civilizational one, definitely not what the Arabs at large, at least in the Hijaz, had, where Islam was born, were a bit weighted to, right? And this is evident also because the Arabs remained that up to the 20th century, and that's why the history of Umayyad Spain is so relevant, because of course you realize that, as we explained many times, all these great Islamic dynasties were fundamentally ruling on the base of previous civilizations. The Abbasids eventually would shift, as you know, the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, and so it's a Mesopotamian power. And the same goes for Fatimid Egypt. The same goes for, in fact, Umayyad Spain. It's in part true also for the Aghlabides of Tunisia. So whenever there was some significant local resources of some kind of regional scale, eventually, the conquerors installed themselves, but get also kind of sucked into the system, and unavoidably they were being hinged to that as well. Now, as we were saying before, in front of the Fatimid Shia, there was a important Sunni Orthodox reaction, right? The establishment that had in fact been founded by with the Sunnah and that had lived in fact in the Umayyad Caliphate as much as in the Fatimid, in the Abbasid one, was being contested now by sort of, what Shia is about. There's this sort of messianic tension that exists, of course, also in the Sunni, but there is still the idea of the, if you want, of the Imam absconditus, in a sense, that has already transfigured, and so thus it's in the wake of their legacy that the true earthly rule eventually has to be traced, as opposed to the authorities against which they had risen. So again, we will talk about the Fatimid power in general, as it had a dramatic effect also in Mesopotamia among the Abbasids. That under Al-Mamun, the Shia were actually about to prevail. Like there could have been to this day a prevalently Shia Islam had the Abbasid Caliphate fundamentally given way. And I talk about Al-Mamun because aside the dramatic figure, contemporary of Charlemagne, is embodying the splendor of Baghdad's court, the golden age of Islam and so on, was actually toying for political reasons, of course, to emancipate the same caliphal power from certain Sunni establishment mechanisms. But on the longer run, the Orthodox line prevailed, and thus the Shia war was confined at the fringes of the same Abbasid world, still being quite influenced by it anyway, because as you know, the Abbasids were still overwhelmingly Persianized in culture, for obvious reasons, and they kept still suffering a sense of these political and theological infiltrations from Iran, and in general the size of their empire, it was a truly universal one, was let's say not much more flexible actually than as we will see, the Umayyads in Spain in a sense, but they had to cope with the presence of a much more extended frontier, that, as we've seen also in the video about the Shishun, the Nizari Ismaili state/sect that was also geographically quite properly framed within what was at least namely the Abbasid Caliphate, that also happened in a time where essentially the power had been taken over, as you know, by the Seljuks, but always in a sense counter-challenged and thus stimulated a great part of what had been the greatness of that civilization, even after the decline of the Caliphate, after at the end of the 10th, beginning of the 11th century, which is also an interesting timeline for the fitna that brought to the Taifas in power in the Umayyad Caliphate, that was actually put down by the same Umayyads. At least the as we will see, the demise of properly of the Caliphate of Cordoba was voluntary. It was decided because it was properly understood from the same center that was at that point under attack. Cordoba had been sacked and so on, was doomed. There was no way to reprisonate that, and that tells you also by which degree these Islamic states were founded on actually a moral principle regarding the role of themselves in the broader Dar al-Islam. I mean, no empire had ever been extended so fast and so wide, except Alexander's one that undoubtedly was also essentially the obsession of the Arabs themselves. I mean, Alexander's epos, albeit being very famous and more important actually than the same Roman or Christian one in Western Europe, is in fact much more culturally impacting and present in the Islamic world than in the Christian one. Historically, right? You find the tale of Alexander even up to Islamic Indonesia in the High Middle Ages. I mean, there was a deep obsession with the figure of Alexander, and so what the Muhammad's successors had achieved, in a broader sense, geographically, was considered from an Islamic perspective as the greatest success after the Alexandrian one, and thus this, in fact, evangelical promise that was contained in the same professional, in fact, precepts and the Islamic religion in the first place. Remember that Islam is fundamentally, in many ways, a product of Iranian, Indo-European religion, right? The entire point of the Holy War, the proceedings, it's identical to the Indo-European religion, right? The ultra also kind of the Arabs were a bit more egalitarian than the Persians, so of course that went declining in a different way. But let's say the essence of the concept of the direct struggle in order to achieve success, it was essentially the unmitigated one. Just some, of course, primitive Bedouins habituated to constant warfare for the sake of survival could, in fact, bring to that extreme that was seen in the first generations of Islam, and that thus had accomplished the construction of the Caliphate. Now, the Islamic schools of law are to be discussed in another video because it's an incredibly important topic, and my advice is always, when studying Islamic history, to, whenever polity you are looking at, of course, looking at what well, of course, the broader religious address, but true, in fact, the interpretation of the Quran, and of course of the opinion on the Sunnah, on the Hadith, and what that meant for that polity, right? The attitude towards, in fact, Muhammad's practice and sayings was quite different in all these powers, depending on the degree and type of regulation on the various communities. And it's obvious that whenever you have an orthodoxy, this mostly fits the needs of an empire, at least of a power that seeks to bring a sort of statal uniformation for the sake of simplicity of unit of command, which are, basic strategic principles, and that objectively do incarnate the degree of a civilization. Whereas fringe powers, let's say contestation powers of some sort, explore, right, and actually deform the broader theological reality, whatever the ideological base is, in a quite exuberant fashion, very often also in a kind of speculative sense that is alien really from the constituted order. The establishment is much more kind of rationally oriented, and that, however, at some point also starts lacking that moral strength that is proper of those communities that instead are put constantly under pressure and thus have to somewhat re-expand to try to seize their own power. So the Abbasids were in fact one of the best embodiment of this, in a sense, in Baghdad they remained quite faithful, in a broader sense, to the originary doctrine of the Quran and the Sunnah, as we have seen, not in a linear way. There were some sympathies also towards the Shia, and the same Sunni schools were somehow more inclined to the idea of kind of, in the Abbasid Caliphate, of a regulatory attitude, trying to limit the importance of the proliferation that had existed at some point, as you know, of the Hadith before they came to be crystallized necessarily. And the Abbasid contributed importantly to this. The idea of a, say, first generation school, that is to say, the first generation of Muslims had followed this. We're talking essentially about the Zahiri, what will become, in fact, in the Abbasid as prevalent, right? And so trying to properly stamp as a dam all the possible, the decentralizing and centrifugal pushes. The Umayyads of Cordoba also were ideologically oriented in the discipline of morals and of the cult. However, according to the Malikite, that is of Medinese origin, juridical teaching, and this one instead extended, the authority to essentially to up to the third generation hadiths, albeit only a selection of them specifically. This helps providing the tools to regularize further, the inquiries regarding how and why the various interpretations were more or less correct. So it may be interpreted in a way as, the need of first of all, a smaller power than the Abbasid one, but still, as we will see, large enough to present significant, ambitions, in fact, of caliphal nature, but also a significantly also urbanized one, not necessarily less than Mesopotamia, but differently so, right? With a tradition that in the West had been remained somewhat much more community-based, oriented in these great cities, starting from the same Cordoba, and so with practices also of Roman or Romanized influence that had remained quite strong, in fact, in southern Hispania, and that were, entailing a greater freedom of the greater liberty of the individual as opposed to the masses in Mesopotamia and or other areas. This is an debatable interpretation, but it still may fit the political administrative needs of the Umayyads in different ways from the one of the Abbasids. And they surely are comparable by a certain degree, right? Especially in the properly in this reaction against the Fatimids that were threatening the same Spain, after all, arguably more than any other agent, let's say, operating in the same Iberian Peninsula, the same Christians of the North, and or some possible interests of the Berbers of North Africa that, however, at this point were dormant. At least the Umayyads were the power there, and if anything, it was them, as we will see now, that tried to secure properly a foothold in North Africa after having disposed of their northern neighbors. Interestingly enough, because the Reconquista was not a linear process, right? There was much more Christian activity at some point before, right, than after. Even in Umayyad times, even closer to the actual sudden dissolution of the Caliphate, right, after significant expeditions such as the ones of Abd-al-Rahman III or Al-Manzur. We also made a video on, as you know, he arrived to essentially sack Santiago de Compostela, and albeit preserving the sanctuary, because the Muslims at that time, as the Christians later were trying to seek, of course, the support of the enormous masses of infidels to rule over the Iberian Peninsula that, as you know, is massive, even just properly as a landmass, and the amount, not much the amount of people, but properly the amount of different territories and areas and so on that made the Umayyad rule somewhat complicated, as it had been the Visigothic one, and also within the same co-religionary area. Toledo, for example, was quite rebellious to Cordoba already in Islamic times by Muslims, right? This was a game between local Muslim rulers, right, who wanted to autonomize, and naturally the Taifas later on were, say, a product of this, but not as much as the internal collapse of the same Cordoban state, because this is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about a truly centralized state with a professional military, with a stable administration. We're talking about some of the greatest achievements of early medieval, high medieval culture. I mean, the Caliphal Library of Cordoba had an estimated 400 to 500,000 manuscripts, as opposed, I don't know, St. Gallen had at the same time only 100, which was really a lot. But I mean, having 500,000 manuscripts, right, that tells you something about the scale, the comparative. I mean, as you know, Spain would remain the destination of all of those Westerners that needed to essentially access the broader theories of, in fact, Islamic texts derived from the Hellenic, the Roman tradition, and re-elaborated with important infusions also from India, from other philosophies, ideas, scientific knowledge that the Muslims had treasured, in fact, in the Near East. And we are aware of this, that in the Golden Age of Islam, there were information that we have lost today, and that instead are indirectly known, existing at the time in places like, in fact, the Umayyad or the Abbasid Caliphates, regarding, for example, the ancient explorations up to Iceland, describing the geysers and so on. You realize these guys had actual sources that, however, went lost, and that at the time, actually, ever since they seized these Byzantine lands, had been immediately treasured by the Islamic conquerors, by very far from the stories of destruction, etc. They did that politically. They did the same. Islamic political propaganda was the one that wanted to show that books were destroyed, but the truth was that the caliphs were, the emirs, whoever accessed them was actually treasuring them, and also in a very Hellenistic way, which was in fact a hidden one, right? The great Hellenistic libraries of the past, basically, they weren't visited by anyone. They were just court libraries. Nobody accessed them. Paradoxically, people read much more in the Latin West, even in ancient times, considering that the Romans were rougher than, say, the Greeks at a broader philosophical, scientific sense. But the access to the sources was actually much more direct, and that's the comparison, in fact, I was drawing before between the Abbasid kind of crystallized orthodoxy and the kind of more still in an orthodox sense, but kind of more more subtle, more inaccessible debate that the Maliki school allowed in Spain, which is interesting because last winter I made a video about the Almo rabbits and the Almohads, and you realize that from this primitive Berbers of the Atlas and even further south, it was kind of a refusal of the degree of speculation that had occurred in Maliki, in the Maliki Umayyad world, and that instead, and they proposed themselves to restore some kind of actually much more primitive, but much more kind of also military oriented, given that these were Bedouin tribes, or at least something they're much more, in fact, warlike compared to the in fact this broader basins again of mostly civilized populations like Spain could be, and so I hope to give the idea of how deeply intertwined these issues really were, because the Sharia there was not just an ideology; it's how people had to be governed, right? So it was a very practical concern, as it had very concrete effects in the direction you wanted your government to go. And as we were saying before, since the Fatimids had disconfessed the Abbasid legitimacy, and they had assumed themselves the caliphal dignity, also the emirs of Cordoba, that up to the beginning of the 10th century hadn't yet dared to formally break the unity of the Islamic world, they proclaimed themselves caliphs. So the international picture again is crucial, because Spain maintained very deep ties with the rest of the Islamic world. The same Maliki influence in Spain is a proof of the context that it still existed with Arabia. In their case, of course, that was true for the entirety of the Islamic world, if anything, for the pilgrimages and all, and whoever ruled, in fact, there, which were evidently not the Umayyads anymore. But as you know, in Islam, the different school of law eventually took on a specific geographic space that is, consequence of the broader local political game rather than wherever these ideas had originated. We've seen in videos about the Umayyad military that we'll have to talk more about, how there is an evident Middle Eastern, even Central Asian, in fact, characteristic in the Hispanic panoply, and there are some innovations and developments in the Iberian Peninsula that are also very autonomous and even advanced compared to areas like, France or Italy, that were not just close, but also, in fact, some the most advanced in the West to become there. So that takes all a very specific, on a very specific meaning, because you realize that Umayyad Spain was overall like a system enclosed in itself. This is a bit how the Iberian Peninsula at large, except perhaps for the northeast, the Ebro Valley, and the greater connections of the Catalonian coast with southern France, Italy, and so on. The continental part, albeit again very composite and diverse, is still enclosed in itself. If anything, it's a geographical reality where you have the Atlantic west, north, you have the Mediterranean east, and you have North Africa in the south that is not exactly, much of an area would receive too much influence, if not for those Berber mercenaries that also contributed significantly to the fitna and the collapse of the same Umayyad Caliphate, but I'm talking mostly in a broader cultural sense. Not that there wasn't anything really North Africa. You know that the Ifriqiya was actually quite prosperous area, and that's what actually the Fatimids had started from, as you know. And also Morocco was important, so much so that after having pacified the Christian north, the Umayyads at a point start taking footholds, in fact, in places like Ceuta, etc. We don't know exactly how much that required in terms of resources and manpower, just know it was significant enough, and probably around that North African policy. Most of the, let's say, the causes of the fitna of the typhus that would bring to the collapse of the caliphate would revolve. The Umayyad Caliphate lasted only 1 century, in practice. It was a century of splendor, right? I'm talking about specifically the Caliphate, not the Emirate before that, which had been stabilized from, say, 788 roughly to, in fact, the beginning of the 10th century had been quite, I'm talking about stabilized properly as Umayyad rule in Cordoba, right? And there were times of great prosperity, but also times of clashes, and especially against the frontier marches, right? So mostly Muslim powers that, however, in the north and the northeast were autonomizing, and they contested the same Cordoban power, bringing to, in fact, wars of devastations and so on. And let's say Cordoba immediately showed to be a pretty sound system. At a point, there was even a Viking attack in Seville, but the Umayyad army came to rout the invaders. There was no way, fundamentally, until the collapse of the Caliphate, that anybody could invade Spain from Africa, as it happened later in that moment of turmoil and fragmentation, instead that favored this Berber Almoravids and Almohads to enter the peninsula again. And the Caliphal period saw a long phase of internal consolidation as well, right? Most of the properly state building had already been established. There was a dramatic continuity from with Roman times in southern Spain. As you know, the Visigoths were more like properly a central Iberian power. They tried to expand importantly in the south. As you know, the Byzantines had retained control of it at least till the end of the 7th century. Then the Muslims arrived at the beginning of the 8th. And immediately they project themselves not just towards the Iberian north, but even into Gaul. Today we do not talk about the remarkable influence that the Umayyads of Cordoba had in over some areas, even the same Phrygia, but important degree, Sicily, as when it was conquered by the Muslims. And the general Saracen peers in the Western Mediterranean, including the bases of Fraxinetum in Provence, and the problem that this base posed to the same Renovatio Imperii of the Ottonians, right? Abd-al-Rahman III is, as you know, probably there was an influence that the same Renovatio Imperii in the Christian West had on the assumption of the Caliphal title by the same Abd-al-Rahman, that had essentially managed to secure control of the northern marches with punitive expeditions that had, again, confirmed the superiority of the Cordoban military over the one of the centralized taifas in the north. The Christians had been mostly contained, right? There was a long, as you know, history of frontier warfare that the Reconquista herself fits, and say that the Umayyads had been successful. They had been victorious in the defense of the northern frontiers against the Kingdom of Leon, that, as you know, and also we were talking about recently, derived from an expansion of the previous Kingdom of the Asturias. But this was still a defense, right? It was not a war of territorial acquisition. In the first hour, say by the 30s of the 8th century, you can argue that, namely, all of the Iberian Peninsula was under the Muslims, because even the furthest power in the north had formally accepted the Islamic lordship, in a sense. This is a concept that, since we have overly emphasized the concept of war of different religions, we escapes to us regarding the same concept of Reconquista. Like after Las Navas in the 13th century, also the rest of Islamic Spain declared itself to be vassal to the Christian kings, and thus the actual Reconquista was finished there, because at least in part these were somewhat Muslims were in friendly terms with recognizing the Christian authority. As we've seen in the video on the Mudayyars, in certain parts of Spain, such as, for example, the Kingdom of Valencia, there were as many Muslims and Jews as 40% of the entire population. And there is a big debate, as far as I know, about the significance of the Christian presence, said conversely, in the Umayyad Caliphate. That is, some people say, well, there were lots of them, they were significant. Others say, well, there weren't really many Christians because most of them had converted. So, unfortunately, when we study the Islamic world in general, I don't know in this case whether because there was a political discontinuity, several wars, much was destroyed, probably all the archives and so on. We have lost that knowledge, but it's not like studying, paradoxically, even the history of the poorer, more primitive Christian north of the peninsula, where we know more. At least, studies have concentrated comparatively in a much more effective way, whereas, the Islamic world is always more complicated to analyze because of lack of sources, and or their properly even their mindset in a different way. But this is not like, as we were saying before, the Near East, the Middle East. This is Europe, right? So it's incredibly important to assess how continuous or discontinuous the, let's say, what had already been molded as some sort of Western mindset was still living in the veins of the Umayyad Caliphal world, broadly speaking, that to them did seem like a universe, right? The reason why Abd-al-Rahman III called himself a caliph for the first time is that he was recognized as such in the old imperial traditional idea, right? But it's evidently in a very different scale, a regional one, essentially the Iberian Peninsula, compared to what the Muslims had been habituated with the same Umayyads back in the day, of, in fact, almost planetary dimension, just in their view, and showing how, of course, these powers had kind of descended a bit more on Earth, also realizing that as the westernmost Islamic power, because the one in Europe, in areas that were significant to sustain such states, they were framed in a broader political game. Again, the Ottonians had revived a universal empire in Central Europe and in Italy, where, by the way, as we've seen, that the Saracens also intervened, especially from Sicily in the south, and were from Fraxinetum, in fact, in Provence. Actually, the Muslims could even, and they did launch raids even in the Rhine Valley, so challenging significantly also the reestablishment, in fact, of a Western universal empire, right? As the same Umayyads had, as the empire had taken over Spain, had fundamentally invaded Gaul immediately. So that they had challenged the Franks, and they had always remain actually in southern France, in spite of the defeat suffered at Poitiers/Tours, as also the southern Frankish vassals at times were actually much more, satisfied with enjoying this kind of, in fact, autonomy that they and trade with the Muslims, by the way, than being brought down by a strong Frankish power that, as you know, also lasted just 1 century in practice. So all these powers realized how relevant, how precious a also pragmatic policy really was. In fact, the Ottonian, the reason why Fraxinetum, for example, lasted so long before being destroyed by the Council of Provence finally, is that the Ottonians accepted that, right? What would be difficult yes, Fraxinetum was kind of a nest in a rocky area and so on, but, it could have been taken, as it would be, it was taken out later, relatively easy way. Well, the reason is that the Ottonians said, okay, you can maintain that pirate nest there as long as we maintain, as in fact the Germanic Empire and the Umayyad one, a kind of balance, right, in the West. Broadly speaking, we don't interfere too much in our affairs that at the end of the day are mostly concentrated respectively in Central Europe, in the Italian peninsula, and in the Iberian peninsula, and partly, yes, also in the Western Mediterranean, but without interfering too much. And this is what large powers, generally speaking, aside from the broader competition that of course exists between them, tend to, in fact, to agree on, while they basically still keep financing proxy wars in between, where also lots of interesting things would happen to counter in part these powers. So there was a broader pride, of course, that derived from the unification of Spain. It's as if this had been a reconquista in a simple sense of conquista, right? Given that the Muslims had taken over the place from a previous Christian past, and they considered the evident goal, let's say, of unifying geographically the entire peninsula up to the Pyrenees, that are pretty solid. It's the fourth frontier that we were saying before, in the northeast, is a pretty compact reality, and of course securing it means to largely stabilize your entire base of power and so on. And naturally, the significant difference in all this is that Cordoba was in the far south, and it was a magnificent city, as you know. It still bears the vestiges of the glorious Islamic past and so on. It was really a true center of power. You can argue that it was a true capital, again, a bit like Constantinople, right? There was not really another competitor. That were just, the cities like Toledo or Zaragoza, or, more close ones, could try to escape the grip of Cordoba, but they couldn't become Cordoba herself. The Umayyads had risked initially to be overthrown by the same Cordobans. There is the famous, in the Emirate period, a rebellion of the suburbs of Cordoba that tells you also how the manpower of the city, in a kind of municipal, also Roman identity legacy, kind of felt themselves. At a point, there were some rebellious Taifa armies that tried to march on Cordoba, and they were stopped by an armies of the local citizens, right? So this tells you what the power of the city is in these areas of southern Europe, especially had been the most radically Romanized, like the Baetica in the far south, and how, let's say, much the survival, in fact, of the Byzantine Empire, but again, the old Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, these were all essentially modeled on the Roman Empire. They simply absorbed the Roman administration. They came on top of it and kept ruling as they had kept doing. So they absorbed that sense of this enormous statal system that costed a lot. It required an enormous bureaucracy and so on. And albeit being this a much more advanced system than the Latin Germanic one at that point, whose politics and institutions were, bradypically, but as we'll see on the longer run, also more consistently consolidating, these states were really bulky things that required an enormous expense to keep up with, or at least that were more exposed, and that were more systemically exposed, let's say, to sudden collapse, right? Just, shifting the balance, let's say, dilapidating the treasure or something could cause a collapse, as it would happen, in fact, at the beginning of or at the end of the 10th century, at the beginning of the 11th, when eventually the empire simply melted away, right? And up to then, however, it was capable of, subsidizing the army. There are interesting sources written by the Caliph of Cordoba to provincial generals, telling them, don't worry, the pay will arrive in time. There was a very centralized administration and really a lot of resources that were employed at some point to successfully instead pacify the north, especially after by the time of Al-Mansur, the Christians in the north had been terrorized and humiliated, right? They were subjects of Cordoba. We have sources also from previous times of the Cordoban court essentially receiving the delegations of the Christians of the north that accepted the Caliphal's suzerainty, and even asked the Caliph to intervene in their disputes, like normally the emperor, even I don't know, in Germany would do. And the Cordobans at the time being rather concerned with their North African endeavors, as we were saying before. Again, what they really wanted was to control the hinterland through coastal holdings, and albeit there doesn't seem to have been a dramatic amount of manpower invested in North Africa, still there was, and so much of a huge cost that would have significantly crippled the Cordoban finances. What really this policy that was aimed at essentially intimidating also the Moroccan leaders and maintaining control on their markets on the coast, brought in, for obvious reasons, lots of Berber mercenaries that were the ones that the Cordobans never quite liked very much. They always had tense relation with the population. And these were essentially Spanish people not liking North Africans, and especially more savage, mercenary that were exactly for this reason chosen by caliphal power over the local nobility that thus at some point began to see this force as a sort of mean for their extradition from the game of power. There were also Christian bodyguards of the caliphal guard, and this is particularly fascinating because, as you know, just as there were Muslims, in the guard of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, and all this kind of things, co-religionaries can be more dangerous because they're more involved in the local affairs, and they fundamentally have rights on their own that the infidels do not have. So the infidel remains actually fidel to the local ruler, exactly because their survival depends on them. Right. Naturally, we don't have to make the interreligionary clashes so dramatic because, again, Cordoban Spain was a pretty multicultural reality, as you understand. It's just that we shouldn't think, not even for a second, that joke that we have been told by liberal teachers about ancient or medieval empires that there was tolerance in a modern sense, right? What you see in the past is just the coexistence and the balance, and politically managed, by the way, and created artificially at some point, between different communities who were competing for power, and that could be used in their, in fact, multicultural profile, so in the natural divisions existing for them, for exactly not making one or the other prevail. This was done by the Hauteville in Sicily as well, with the Orthodox, with the Latins, the Muslims, and etc. This was done, even in the Crusader states. There was done in Constantinople as well. It was full of Muslim merchants. We've seen the Turcopoles. We've seen in that video the Frankish mercenaries in the Sultanate of Rome. So lots of interesting things that tell you, of course, that power is not really an opinion how to be held, and you must always find all the possible means to keep yourself standing. There were operations over time also against the Christian seigneuries that had been forming between the Pyrenees and the Ebro Valley. Specifically, Abd-al-Rahman III had waged war there. He had besieged Pamplona as far as that, so we're talking about Navarre. These were also some of the most kind of Gallic-influenced realities, the most difficult to reach, and that shows also the projectional capacity of the Islamic armies that when they wanted from Cordoba could move as far as that. And yet, as I was saying before, actually the greatest threat of all was an ideological one, at least as far as just the territorial integrity of the caliphate was concerned, because of the presence also in the western Maghreb of a thick competition between the Umayyads and the Fatimids, because the latter were naturally trying to sustain the resistance in North Africa, or at least fueling some sort of hostility towards the Cordobans. And as you know, the Fatimids eventually lost North Africa. Let's say narrowly meant they just focused mostly on the Nile Valley, and everything that was west was gradually lost. Right, there were other powers that emerged, unironically or ironically enough, in both sense, in the same areas where they themselves had emerged. Again, the Shia had done that in a frontier that was, in fact, the Maghreb, that in the Islamic world is always perceived as the weird kind of pagan place where there are still wizards, strange women. That, if you have read 1000 and a Night, but the bias there is from the that more, again, orthodox and civilized, courts of Baghdad, but primarily, let's say, from any kind of more civilized centers, also Cairo and also Cordoba for that matter. It's a bit the same thing that the French or German crusaders thought of the Siculo-Norman ones, when, considering that they were so, close to the Muslims in St. Sicily. And so it was, again, the struggle of a central orthodoxy against a peripheral heterodoxy. And this is quite important for a power that, again, decides to take on a caliphal title, and it shows you how much, indeed, Spain is not just enclosed in itself, but it opens and is mostly concerned about actually the North African sector as a source of possible interference, right? At least in the north, they knew that there was a Christian frontier. Fundamentally, they never cared more than much about any threat coming from the north, because the Franks, let's say, it's not in Cordoban, in Umayyad times in Spain that the Carolingians carry out the campaigns, at least not the rise properly of the Umayyads of Cordoba, their campaigns with the Spanish mark and so on. Right after, by the time of the Cordobans' rise to power, the Carolingian Empire is dying, so no power would threaten an invasion like up to the 13th century, like, when the French managed to secure the south of France and invade Spain again. So when things had changed quite a lot, right, also with the practical victory, as we were saying before, of the Christians after Las Navas in the peninsula. So not really a threat there. Probably the Umayyads were much more concerned about the Ottonian expansion in southern Italy, because surely at some point they thought that if they had scored, the Germans had scored some important victory, as they wouldn't. Think about the massacre of Cotrone, for example, in 982. That it was a bloodbath of the German establishment. But if they had won there, the Saracens had lost. Well, also Sicily would have been threatened, and there you have the Straits in the hands of the Christians, and that would sever significantly the caliphate from the rest of the Islamic world by sea, and basically entirely, because in North Africa just have this coastal stripe of connections. Then the hinterland is semi-arid at best, and that also wouldn't happen because southern Italy was, a far stretch for the Ottonians as well. But at some point that kind of happened, and that's why I said that the caliphal title was also a response probably to the revival of the empire, right, in the West as well, but not in that kind of direct existential core contact with each other. I mean, Spain and Germany are quite distant after all. Now, the the collapse, like this video, as you understand, is pretty generalistic, but we will hopefully make videos about the actual chronistic events that brought to the end of the caliphate, because at least from our sources, everything was so sudden, right? Everything seemed kind of going fairly well. This happens in many empires. Like, you hardly see an empire that is showing the signs of collapse and then it takes a lot to collapse. Now, very often you don't even see them until it basically happens in a relatively short time. And so much so in the case of the Cordoban one, because it had been troubled, let's say, mostly by the ethnic tensions that were forming between the Berber mercenaries and the broader populace and this other lordship that ruled Muslim Spain. And the latter began essentially to attack Cordoba, began to exploit the moments of weakness of succession or dilapidation of inheritances by the side of the caliphs to attack this big, fat, rich south, right? So that is also a very specific dynamics in the Iberian Peninsula. The south was the majority of the population was concentrated, where the greater infrastructures were. There were villas, there were baths that were created by the caliphs. There were mills, water mills were built significantly in the area. They contributed later on also to the spread of paper production that passed, as you know, through the Islamic world from the Battle of Talas River, when allegedly some Chinese prisoners revealed the secret of paper to the Arabs, and then they arrived in the West through Spain, through this paper mills, in fact, and then the Italians got it themselves and spread them further. So we're talking about again a very solid base of power that was squandered in a way just for merely political reasons, as far as we see, because there didn't seem to be any specific symptom of a broader decline. It is true that the Islamic world already at that point had passed its heyday, and it was somewhat disgregating politically. The same crisis of the Abbasids in front of the Ghulams, of the Turks, specifically. There was a feudalization, as you know. The Seljuks were heavily persecuted to spread that kind of private idea of power, and in fact, after their wave of conquest, there hardly was anything like a Seljuk empire encompassing everything, or just different principalities. The same happened with the Taifas in Spain. So at a point, again, the Umayyads themselves decide that the caliphate as such, and thinking how in a non-modern and secularized way they thought that these things, could not be revived. That is to say, the caliphal title had to be worth of its name, had to be mirroring real power on earth. And they decided not to revive it. And this was particularly interesting because it also marked the end of Cordoba, that had been, in fact, the center of Spain, and at that point irremediably declined. I mean, not overnight, but let's say the end of the Caliphal court also brought to the to this broader political fragmentation around, from which many cities emerged. Right, Spain was, as we were saying before, also from Roman times, significantly urbanized, as most southern Europe comparatively to the rest really was. So the Taifas were mostly centered around this cities, and they were scattered all over the Iberian plateau, right? So, as you know, the Reconquista that we have discussed often was just this endless, methodic, Cartesian-like work of siege, counter-siege, etc., that went on for literally, let's say, the most intense phase was half of a millennium in practice, right? So it shaped the entire region culturally in a way that basically no other in Europe really was, and it's also in a kind of, in fact, separated way, in a way that was quite unique in its kind, and is comparable for some traits, but also not comparable for others, for the rest of Western Europe, which, again, the region was somewhat relatively isolated from, in spite of, doesn't matter that the massive Frankish influence, the fact that the Pope eventually took the grip on the local churches and so on, but still in all the crusading international cooperative effort, but the Iberian princes always maintained some kind of properly peculiar traits in their culture, their government, in their way of war too, and this should be deepened significantly. I made really many videos about the Reconquista as well, but it's not that we really went ever in thorough detail so far. So there is really a lot to cover, because again, the place is huge, and the time is huge as well, and it requires particular attention. But this attention must start, of course, from not much from just the Reconquista per se, but from the end also, and or the beginning, what had been the Emirate and Caliphate of Cordoba, especially since the end of the 9th century, and also actually even more since the Abbasid usurpation in Damascus, and so how eventually some elements also of the Umayyad clan had been welcomed in say, maybe not so much in Spain, because the previous governors weren't happy at all, but let's say they had a much greater, they were the Caliphal clan, right? So that's also how that rule was reinstated in a dynastic sense eventually in the land. And so you know what the afterwards really was. The Caliphate dissolved itself in a plurality of autonomous Muslim emirates that on the long run wouldn't be able to effectively cope with the Christian offensives from the north, right? But even that process, as you know, took centuries to happen. There were some interesting comebacks, especially under the Almoravids and the Almohads, that scanned some other phases, kind of other good centuries of Islamic revival. At some point, probably coming back, before even such a victorious time like Las Navas. I described this paradoxically in the video about Innocent III, because that was, in fact, one of the great accomplishments of Christianity in that moment, because the Muslims had just struck back, and so it was not really to be given for granted that their Reconquista was over, right? So, as you know, things really went on even after the beginning of the 13th century. But we're really talking about other times compared to our own. So I would stop it here. And back in the day, I made much more videos about Islamic history, because I drew from kind of more manualistic basis than today. But which I did, by the way, because there was I'm preparing some particular videos, so it takes a bit more of time to make them, and so I may resort to this kind of manualistic approach some other time, but I keep these as reserves, aside from the other videos that I re-upload from the ones whose pictures are require the Creative Commons license. But it's really important to focus on this broader Iberian space, because at the end of the day, that's what these communities really were, and the various dominations were just at the end of the day a reflection of what was going on in this region, rather than an external influence. So an external control, right? They were ruling from this place, right? And as big as it is, so of course within it there were properly other dominations, and I think the Umayyads represent this quite well, for which they're worth being analyzed more. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.